Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event. Last week, I was so excited to come up to Madison and meet Carol and Jenny, who put this event together. And then on Monday, I got COVID, and I've had quite a tough case of COVID over the last couple of days, and decided to run this talk virtually, just for the safety of everyone involved and for my own health as well. But I wish I could be there in person. This is a wonderful event that's being hosted at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Carol and I have had some wonderful conversations over the summer, and we are kindred spirits, to say the least. I want to talk today as a humanist and as a philosopher about what it means to grow old and become intimate with our own mortality. This is oftentimes a frightening confrontation. And one of the things that existentialism as a philosophy provides us is some intellectual and spiritual tools to allow us to cozy up to death and see the ways in which aging and dying can serve as a teacher for us. And I want to begin by introducing a very commonly cited study by a palliative care and end-of-life nurse named Bonnie Ware. Some of you may be familiar with this study. She identified over a span of 15 years common regrets among the aging and dying. And as she put her data together, she came up with some interesting and not too surprising results. A number of people in the last days, weeks, and months of their lives said, I wish I had let myself be happier. Many said, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. Others said, I wish I had been better at expressing my feelings. A common one nowadays is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard throughout most of my life and career. All of these are interesting kind of confessionals as we move into the twilight or the evening of our lives. But the finding that most people reported in terms of regret was this one. I wish I had the courage to be true to myself. This is an existential concern. What does it mean to be true to oneself? And is it possible that as we move into the evening of life, that it's easier for us to let go of our own ego-driven needs and concerns and identify what really matters in our lives? Is it possible that we're able to trivialize the trivial as we move into our later years and become more honest and open and accepting of ourselves? And I want to suggest that that's possible. And existentialism as a philosophy is one that is specifically focused on this most profound question: who am I? And maybe more specifically, what is the meaning of my life? And this question hinges on what is arguably the core maxim of existential philosophy. And this is a maxim that was introduced by a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger, and it was then shortened and popularized by a French philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre. And the claim is that existence precedes essence. And what this means is that, unlike other animals, that human beings have no pre-given nature or essence that ultimately determines us. Because whatever determines us, whether it's our biology, our sexuality, our socioeconomic circumstances, our religious background, what distinguishes us as humans is that we are able to interpret and give meaning to those determinations. We're always free to interpret and make sense of whatever it is that determines us. And this is something that my cat can't do. My cat is kind of trapped in the web of instincts that determines her. What this means is that unlike other animals, we are self-making, self-fashioning beings. We make ourselves who we are through our ongoing, moment-to-moment choices and decisions. And what this means is that the self, the sense of who I am, is not a static and enduring thing. It's a dynamic process of becoming, of realizing who we are as we move through the stages of our lives. So one of the things that existentialists will say is that if you're one of those people that says, that's just the way I am, take it or leave it, I've always been this way, for the existentialist, you're actually not being honest with yourself. You're living in a state of self-deception or inauthenticity. You're never how you are. There is no way that you actually are, because you can always choose to change and shift and recreate yourself as your life unfolds. And this possibility for self-creation endures right up until the moment of death. No matter how old I am, I can always remake or reinterpret myself right up until I die. And so we have this inside of us, this capacity for tremendous freedom, flexibility, and self-creation, regardless of the ageist stereotypes that older adults are bombarded with every day. That old age is kind of a destiny where we become trapped in our bodies and become enslaved to the medical industrial complex. One of the things that I want to do in this talk is kind of undermine those assumptions. But I also want to kind of explore why it is that we treat older adults in the dismissive and negative way that we do in our modern Western society. And I want to suggest that a big part of our denigration of older adults stems from our own experience of death anxiety. For existential philosophers, death anxiety is the most primal, foundational of all moods. It discloses who we really are, that we are finite, temporal, impermanent creatures who are always moving towards our own death. And in the back of our minds, we're aware of this. We know that this is true because we're self-conscious. We're aware of who we are. Humans are self-conscious and self-aware, again, in a way that other animals are not. So deep down, we're aware that our being is always threatened by the possibility of non-being. And we don't know when non-being is going to come. So the great Danish existentialist Søren Kierkegaard refers to death as our most uncertain certainty. In other words, we know we're going to die, but we're unsure of when we're going to die. But as we move into old age, that uncertainty becomes more and more a certainty. We understand that the horizon of time is starting to narrow and contract, and we start to run up against our own temporal limits. But when we're young and healthy in youth and middle age, we spend much of our time fleeing from the basic truth of our own mortality. This is something that is especially common in modern Western cultures. Not as common in indigenous cultures or in pre-modern cultures where death was part of the fabric of everyday life and generations in a family lived together under one roof. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we defend against death anxiety, some of the ways that we flee from our own mortality for our own psychological self-protection. And this, again, is something that existentialists have examined and picked up on. And terror management theorists in social psychology have explored this. The great cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker explores this in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death. So let's examine some of these defense mechanisms. One of the ways that we can defend against our own death is to believe in God. And with that belief in God comes with it a belief in the immortality of the soul. So we understand that our physical bodies will die, but there's something non-physical or immaterial about who we are, and that is our soul. Our soul will live on after we die, and that can provide tremendous comfort for us as we get overwhelmed with death anxiety. Another common defense is the belief that we will live on through our children, that our children will take our name and our legacy and our interests and our DNA, our genetic material will be passed on into future generations, and we will somehow live on in these generations. This is why having children, especially male children, has been such an important part of the fabric of Western culture. Another common belief in covering over death anxiety is that the accumulation of wealth or our own work will have some enduring significance. So when Carol mentioned some of the books that I've written, this is one of the ways that I shelter myself from death anxiety. I write books and I think, well, even after I die, people will read my books, and that means part of me will endure on in generations long after I've passed. Of course, all of these are manifestations of self-deception for the existential. These are all fundamentally dishonest motivations. Another belief is the belief in our own specialness. This is something that is a very common among children and young adults, that death happens to other people, but it doesn't happen to me because I'm special. And belief in our own specialness is actually a very strong core belief. It's very easy to imagine other people dying, but it's very difficult for us to get our minds around the fact that I am going to die. Because I've been told by my parents and by my friends and maybe by my religious organizations that I'm special and that death doesn't really belong to me. And in our own age of biomedical science and advances in technology, there's the belief that life will be extended indefinitely through medical and technological advancements. And that one day maybe we'll be able to download our consciousness into machines, and all of our experiences and desires and needs and history will be accessible, and that history that has been downloaded can then be transplanted into another physical body once the technology catches up with it. Now, what I want to suggest, of course, is that none of these are sincere and honest confrontations with finitude. They're all manifestations of flight from death, denial. And ageism itself, I want to suggest, is a manifestation of death denial. And the reason is because illness and old age are invitations for us to confront death anxiety. Chronic illness, a cancer diagnosis, a heart attack, the movement, the inexorable movement towards old age, are all invitations to confront death anxiety, to move closer to it, to become intimate with it. But ageism, especially in our culture, manifests because older persons are frightening. They are reminders of our own essential finitude and vulnerability. And one of the things that we do in our culture is that we denigrate older persons by drawing a sharp distinction between us and them. We're not like them. Older people are to be avoided. They shouldn't be allowed to vote. They shouldn't be able to drive. They should be partitioned or warehoused in nursing homes or retirement communities. That's not me. I'm different from them. Now, ageism, as a cultural manifestation in the West, is a very weird kind of bias. Because unlike other isms, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, ageism isn't directed at others. Ageism is directed at our own future selves. When we denigrate older people, we're denigrating who we will become. And so one of the things that I explore in my own research is ageism as a form of self-hatred. That we actually hate where we are headed. We hate who we are going to become. We're going to end up like our grandparents or our parents. This is a very strange manifestation of bias. It's not directed at others, it's directed at ourselves. A great French existentialist, Simone de Beauvoir, wrote an incredible book called Le Vieux, which just translates as old age. And in this book, she talks about ageism. And she says, we carry this ostracism so far that we reach the point of turning it against ourselves. For in the old person we must become, we refuse to recognize ourselves. It is ourselves that we hate as we move into the evening of our own lives. What I want to suggest is that aging and dying are not something to turn away from. They're phenomena that are basic and fundamental to the human condition. And insofar as we try to integrate aging and dying into our lives are actually enriched and enhanced because we're pulled away from trivial distractions and reminded of the urgency and preciousness of this life. Recognizing our existence as a way of being towards death reminds us that this life is not a dress rehearsal. And that injects a measure of intensity and gravity and richness into our lives. And one of the things that we get in the existentialist tradition is the recognition that death should be viewed as a teacher. And what it teaches us is our own temporal nature. It reminds us that we are finite beings, that our time is limited, that our time is short, and that our lives cannot be postponed until tomorrow, until next year, or even next month. I want to read a short quote from the great German language poet Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke said, "Believe me, that death is a friend, maybe the only one who is never deterred by our actions and indecision. With death, we can passionately affirm our being there. Death is the real yes-sayer." And Rainer Maria Rilke had a huge impact on a very influential German philosopher named Martin Heidegger, whose masterwork was called Being in Time. And in Being in Time, Heidegger says something similar to what Rilke says. Heidegger says, along with sober anxiety, which brings us face to face with death, there goes an unshakable joy in this possibility. In it, existence becomes free from the entertaining distractions with which we busy ourselves. And what Heidegger wants to suggest here is that most of our lives, when we're living in a state of death denial, we just go through the motions. We do what everyone else does. We conform, we walk in lockstep with social norms, and much of our lives are kind of bound up in trivial distractions. And what death awareness can do, or has the power to do for us, is shake us out of those routines, shake us out of our own tranquilized drift, and awaken us to what really matters in life. And if you read reports from oncologists and palliative care physicians, you see a number of interesting narratives that capture just this experience of awakening, of kind of being born again in the face of death. And I want to read an anecdote from a woman named Karen, who was dying of kidney failure. Kathy, who was dying of kidney failure. And Kathy describes this as a kind of awakening. She says the first Kathy died during dialysis. She could not make it long in the face of death. A second Kathy had to be born. This is the Kathy that was born in the midst of death. The first Kathy lived for trivia only. But the second Kathy, that's me now, I am infatuated with life. Look at the beauty of the sky. It's gorgeously blue. I go into a flower garden and every flower takes on such fabulous colors that I am dazzled by their beauty. One thing I do know, had I remained the first Kathy, I would have played away my whole life, and I would never have known what the real joy of living was all about. I had to face death eyeball to eyeball before I could live. I had to die in order to live. But of course, what the existentialists are saying is that you don't need a terminal diagnosis to have this epiphany, to experience this awakening. We're always already terminal. We're always already a being towards death. And that awareness has the power to wake us up again, so that we can be dazzled and in awe of the everyday beauties of life, the ordinary experiences of transcendence. Part of this experience of awakening, I want to suggest, occurs naturally. Because as we move into old age, the horizon of our temporal lives begins to contract and narrow. When we're in youth and middle age, the future is vast. It holds a vast and wide range of possibilities for us to press into. And in this period of our lives, our orientation is largely acquisitive. We're consuming new experiences, relationships, and projects. We're kind of taking and taking, acquiring more and more. And when we live in this attitude, we assume that time is endlessly expansive and open. But there's a point in the life course when we begin to move towards death, and the vast horizon of temporal possibilities begins to narrow and contract. And this is what I call the contraction of time. And what I want to suggest is that when we experience our time as contracting, it's really an opportunity for personal growth and transformation. Becoming aware of ourselves as aging and dying can shake us out of the false security of the acquisitive attitude that we had in youth and middle age, and wake us up to the fact that our time is limited. And when this happens, we come face to face with what existentialists call the ultimate questions. When one's future is genuinely grasped as contracting, rather than a horizon that's endlessly open, it can shift our orientation and illuminate these ultimate questions. What really matters in my life? And what is the purpose of my life? So it's interesting that often it's in the end of our lives, towards the end of our lives, in the second half of our being, that we start to really confront these serious questions. That in youth and middle age, the urgency of these questions doesn't seem as pressing. But as we move into old age, it becomes much more pressing. And the contraction of time in this way also reveals a paradox when it comes to our understanding of happiness. And this is something that Carol has done quite a bit of work on herself. One of the things that the existentialists want to make clear is that in the modern world, we misunderstand happiness as some sort of pleasurable feeling. We think happiness has something to do with acquiring pleasures, shopping, travel, eating out, having sex, drinking wine, playing golf. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But pleasures are not the same thing as flourishing or fulfillment. The way that happiness was originally conceived in the Greek tradition, when Aristotle introduced the phrase eudaimonia as the word for happiness, which doesn't mean pleasurable feelings, it means flourishing, to flourish as a human being. When we misunderstand or mistake happiness as a pleasure, it results in a kind of experience of conditional happiness. And I call this if-only happiness. If only I were promoted at work, I would be happy. If only I had a slimmer body, I would be happy. If only I made more money, I'd be happy. And as we move into our later years, if only I could retire from work, I will be happy. If only I could get through this illness, I will be happy. That's not going to work. Conditional happiness always puts us on what social psychologists call a hedonic treadmill, where we're always chasing after the next pleasure, chasing after the next thing that can give me or provide for me pleasurable feelings. And one of the virtues or beauties of growing older is that we're forced to step off the hedonic treadmill. We can no longer chase those pleasures that we could in youth and middle age. And paradoxically, our quality of life often goes up because of this. In other words, insofar as we're no longer chasing shallow, superficial pleasures, our quality of life begins to improve. And this is one of the interesting puzzles or paradoxes of old age, that happiness or experiences of personal fulfillment often occur on a you. That we're least happy or fulfilled in our lives in our youth. We're trying to build a career, we're driven by ego and narcissism and ambition. And in middle age, it even dips slowly, even worse, because in middle age, this is when we have stresses of family and more work responsibilities. And then as we move into the second half of life or in the evening of life, our happiness starts to go up again. And so I want to suggest that it's possible that we can become more authentic and more satisfied with our lives as we grow older. And this has been borne out in a number of empirical studies in social psychology in an area called social-emotional selectivity theory. And in social-emotional selectivity theory, studies have shown that as we grow older, we become more selective in our commitments and our projects. And we tend to invest more in deep, rich interpersonal relationships and forms of communication that are intimate and honest. And the vast network of friends that we had in youth and middle age starts to shrink and narrow until we bond with just a handful of people that we can have deep and meaningful connections with. And the projects that we embark on are the projects that matter to us. They're the projects that are true to who we are. So empirical studies have demonstrated that this may be the case, that we tend to become more authentic and true to ourselves as we move into the evening of life. We become more comfortable with life's ambiguity, with life's mystery. And we also become comfortable of not really knowing who we are. When we're young in our working lives, we tend to have it all figured out. We kind of know who we are. That's who I am. That's who I'll always be. But as we get older, we start to get a little bit more confused. I thought that's who I was. And in that confusion or that mystery or that ambiguity, it doesn't cause anxiety. We're okay with it. We're more comfortable with the mystery of existence. And so I want to look at a couple of remarks by some folks that have kind of worked through these stages into the last few years of their lives and experienced deep moments of authenticity and personal transformation. And I want to read from a woman, Beth, 92 years old, living in a long-term care facility. And she's been living in this long-term care facility for 10 years. She says, what is most surprising to me is that in some respects I feel more fulfilled, more true to myself than I've ever felt in my life. I understand myself and others in ways I would not have been able to when I was younger. I feel better able to speak my mind, to feel seen and heard. That's a typo, obviously, heard, H-E-A-R-D. And to recognize what I can share, and with whom I can share it. I am also able to reflect on my limitations and to be less prone to guilt and shame. I know at times I do go to dark places. I have learned not to stay there. I understand that adapting to loss can be a major source of strength and of personal growth. So here we see Beth really kind of coming into her own as a 92-year-old long-term care resident. Her life isn't diminished, it's actually been enhanced as she's confronted these existential givens that we spend so much of our lives fleeing from. I want to read another quote from the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Carl Jung wrote this line in his autobiography right before he died. He was 83 years old when he was writing it. And he talks about how, as he's gotten older, he's become much more comfortable with ambiguity and mystery. He writes, I am astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I am distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once, and I cannot add up the sum. I have no judgment about myself and my life. There is nothing I am quite sure about. The more uncertain I have felt about myself, the more there has grown up in me a feeling of kinship with all things. In other words, as he becomes more comfortable with the mystery of existence, he starts to see himself in everything. He has this experience of profound connection, of interconnection with all living things. It's a kind of experience of awe and wonder as he comes up against his own temporal limits. And then I want to read one more quote from the great Oliver Sacks, who just died recently and wrote a profoundly moving memoir that's just called Gratitude. And Oliver Sacks, the great neurologist and author, was in the last days of living with metastatic cancer. And this is what he wrote right before he died. He says, my predominant feeling is one of gratitude. I have loved and been loved. And I have been given much, and I have given something in return. I have read and traveled and thought and written. I have had intercourse with the world. Above all, I have been a sentient being, a thinking animal on this beautiful planet. And that in itself has been an enormous privilege and adventure. And you get a sense here that Oliver Sacks has really confronted and integrated his own death into the last moments and days and hours of his life. And he has been transformed. And the feeling that dominates isn't anxiety, it isn't despair, it's not regret, it's gratitude. And I want to say something just in closing. I wrote this book, One Beat More, Existentialism and the Gift of Mortality. And I'm 53 now, so I'm not necessarily at death's door. But 5 years ago, I suffered a major heart attack, a widowmaker heart attack, when I was finishing up a 60-mile bike ride that I would do regularly on weekends with friends. This time I was riding alone. After the emergency surgery, I had a serious bout of what's called ventricular tachycardia, which made me susceptible to sudden cardiac death or cardiac arrest. And then I had a series of very dangerous blood clots in my femoral artery. And I was someone who prided himself on his health and his fitness, and was really, even though I taught existentialism, was quite in denial of my own mortality, and was very good at living in self-deception. Well, the heart attack and the accompanying complications shocked me out of that complacency. And the thing that occurred that was interesting is that the wisdom that I gained from that heart attack occurred mostly in cardiac rehab, where I was surrounded with adults who were at least 20 or 30 years older than me. And I started having conversations with them about aging and dying. And what became clear to me is that these elders in cardiac rehab were in much graver situations than I was in, were much more sanguine and comfortable and serene about their own death. And so over the weeks and months that I went through cardiac rehab, I learned from my elders. They taught me and inspired me. And out of that experience, I wrote this book, One Beat More, about dying and aging. And so I hope you get a chance to take a look at it. Carol has a few copies coming her way from my publisher. Again, I wish I could have been there in person with you all to share in this wonderful event.